give us a flag, all free without a stain. To defend it as our fathers disobeyed. Your gallant from the end will make the rebels dance. Stand up the union if we only have a chance.
At the beginning of the war, the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment was the most despised, laughed at, and cursed unit in the Army. Yet within just 6 months of mustering in, they all became heroes.
They changed in a day the face of war, the face of the war between the states, and the face of social expectations in the United States.
It was in the first months of 1863 when 1,000 men, called the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, became the first black regiment to enlist in the North. It was a time when America was a racist country, North and South, and most whites didn't pretend to accept people of African descent on any social level.
The ideas of racial inferiority were ideas that most white Americans had, whether those white Americans were in the North or whether they were in the South. The difference was that in the South, those ideas were used to support an institution of human bondage. In the North, those ideas supported racial segregation, racial discrimination.
There were 4.5 million African Americans in the United States at the time of the Civil War, with only about 500,000 living free, half in the North and half in the South. The rest were slaves, in the eyes of the law articles of property, with no control over their destiny.
You would have to work in the terminology of the slaves from can to can't, from the time that you could see in the morning till the time that you couldn't see at night. You were very, very close, in many respects, to an animal. They were just incredible and constant hammering away at one's self-esteem because there was no place to run, no place to go, and no way to escape slavery save the grave.
But even for those who had escaped slavery or were born free and lived in the North, racism was still the rule, and civil rights were few.
The idea of being free black is probably best described as being a slave without a master. There were so many restrictions on travel, on lodging, on housing, on property. You could not, of course, offer testimony in court. There were so many restrictions that, again, you were treated very, very much like a slave.
When the first shot was fired in the war between the states, there was no question. The South was fighting to protect and preserve slavery. But the North, on the other hand, didn't take up arms to end it. In fact, abolition was really not the issue.
Northern men did not enlist and risk their lives in order to free slaves. They enlisted to save the Union and to avenge the insult to the flag.
And in truth, the great emancipator himself, Abraham Lincoln, was willing to tolerate slavery where it already existed, just to keep the country together.
As he said time and again, if he could preserve the nation with slavery, he would do it. If he could preserve the nation without slavery, he would do it. His paramount goal always was the preservation of the Union.
Ironically, Lincoln ignored one of his most powerful weapons of war for many bloody months and even years. It was the arm of the black man. Since Fort Sumter, abolitionists had been mounting pulpits and filling halls, preaching that the best way to win the white man's war was to let the black man fight.
Frederick Douglass said that the three things that would come of this war would be first, the cartridge box, next, the jury box, and lastly, the ballot box. And so clearly citizenship was an important part of what these men were fighting for.
Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters U.S., let him get an eagle on his button. and a musket on his shoulder and bullets in his pocket. And there is no power on earth which can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship in the United States. Frederick Douglass, 1862.
Frederick Douglass, the most eloquent and militant champion for black freedom, began to campaign relentlessly for Negro enlistment in the Army. He lobbied the government. He crusaded in Europe. He traveled so much, his wife mailed him fresh clothes so he could keep up the grueling pace.
The most important element of this whole scenario would be utilizing thousands, even millions perhaps, of black soldiers as an important arm against the Confederacy. Douglass was once asked, would the slave fight? He responded that no, the slave would not fight. But he said if you asked him, would the black man fight? The answer was yes.
But most of white America did not even consider African Americans men, much less capable of becoming soldiers. Northerners were convinced that if blacks went to battle, they would either become cowards or somehow become beasts.
Thinking that they were somehow mentally inferior, they wouldn't learn the proper orders and the bugle calls and the drum rolls, that they wouldn't follow orders when in battle, and indeed in battle would perhaps turn and run. The obverse of that is also the fear that being somehow descended from wild, savage, barbarian natives in Africa, that they indeed might not observe the common rules of war.
But as the war moved forward, the Union became bloodied and weary. In the Battle of Fredericksburg alone, over 12,000 Northern troops were killed. In Shiloh, 13,000.
The United States was facing a war that was the largest in its history. It was facing military campaigns with tens of thousands of people involved, more so than it ever had before. This was the first modern war. The casualties were tremendous, and therefore it was important that blacks make the point that white America cannot win this war alone.
Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah.
Finally, as abolitionists had put it, Old Abe needed the sable arm. And on September 22nd, 1862, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation that paved the way for black enlistment. White America would not win this war alone. Now black soldiers would rally round the flag to help save the country and their race.
Ready? Hey! Fire!
The official arming of a black troop was the white South's worst nightmare. The very idea of a black man with a gun had a devastating psychological effect on the rebels.
Part of the psychological price white Southerners paid for slavery was the fear of servile insurrection, slave rebellions. And I mean, think of it. You just had to, in your heart, believe that people that you had kept chained, that you had exploited, that you had treated as non-persons, if they were given weapons and a chance to get even, well, wouldn't they?
Governor John A. Andrew of the state of Massachusetts, himself an ardent abolitionist, fought for and won the right to raise the first colored regiment from the North, the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry.
Every race has fought for liberty and its own progress. The colored race will create its own future by its own brains, hearts, and hands. Governor John Andrew, 1863.
Andrew wanted only the best, only the very best of men for his regiment. For this was to be the model, the vanguard, the noble experiment. And it must not fail.
He wanted the cream of black Northern manpower. He wanted men who had been born free,
men who had never known the lash, who had never had to call anyone else master because he thought that they would show more initiative, that they would not be intimidated by their Confederate enemies.
When enlistment began, the ranks filled fast. It was hard to resist the call to arms from a man like Frederick Douglass.
The day dawns. The morning star is bright upon the horizon. The iron gate of our prison stands half open. One gallant rush from the north will fling it wide open, while 4 million of our brothers and sisters shall march out into liberty. Frederick Douglass, 1862.
Motivations for enlistment were clear. Black men knew this was their chance to make the Civil War one of the most successful slave revolts in the history of the world.
To sit on the sidelines and watch this happen around them and not participate would be unthinkable to any man who could. And also, a lot of them faced a lot of pressure in their home black communities to go forward and fight, from fathers, sisters, sweethearts, and wives.
But the black population in Massachusetts just wasn't big enough to raise the regiment. So Andrew sent recruiters to Connecticut, New York, Missouri, Pennsylvania, even Canada. Often, gathering places were kept secret and recruits put on trains under the cover of darkness. But finally, the 54th was filled with men who would finally have their chance to strike at slavery.
I think that the typical soldier of the 54th was a man who could read and write, a man who had a profession, be he an artisan, a clerk, a barber, a small businessman of some kind, a farmer. They were people who worked for a living. They were not runaway slaves by and large, and they were people who were risking a very great deal to go to war in the Deep South for their ideals.
Among the recruits were at least one physician, one druggist, several printers, and engineers. Their literacy rate was considered higher than an average Confederate, and they were young. Eli George Biddle was only a boy when he signed up for the 54th. He was barely 17. But young as this man was then, he was already a crusader. Eli's mother had bought the family's freedom from her master in Pennsylvania and then moved her children to Boston. There, Eli was enrolled in a Quaker school.
I think it created in him a consciousness, a powerful personal consciousness that he had to see his family do better and have a better future. And as young as he was, I think that this became a commitment, a crusade.
In fact, young Eli became a protester. Very aware of the social climate of the time, he ran away from his Quaker school, alone and without money, because he didn't believe in all that they taught.
As a routine, they sang "My Country 'Tis of Thee, Sweet Land of Liberty" every morning. And I guess he thought about the words of that particular song. And he came to the conclusion that this is something he should not be singing. And he was warned that you'll be expelled from the school. Well, this is where Eli made his stand as a young boy, and he took the expulsion.
Eli walked miles and miles through towns looking for an enlister and became the youngest man in Company A of the 54th. This was Eli's only way to strike a blow for liberty. But the famous Frederick Douglass had another. Even though he couldn't himself join the regiment, he offered his sons to serve for him.
Douglass himself wanted to serve as an officer and wanted to expose himself to physical danger, but that was not allowed by the Army. Douglass's two sons, however, acted in his stead. Lewis Douglass as the sergeant major of the 54th Massachusetts, who was known as the Lion of the regiment.
The 54th was ready. Ready to begin training and ready to begin the fight. As Douglass said, give them a chance. Stop calling them niggers and call them soldiers. Now the 54th had its chance.
We'll make the rebels stand.
1,000 young, able-bodied men ready to train. All he needed were officers. And of course, they would all be white.
Were blacks capable of exercising the responsibilities of officers? I think most white Americans in the 1860s would have said no, they weren't. So that was one reason why it was difficult to make the case for blacks being officers. The other thing is the difficulty of seeing blacks as gentlemen. What would be the expectation when white enlisted men were in the presence of black officers? Would these white enlisted men be expected to show respect to these black officers? These were all very complex kinds of things.
Many blacks deeply resented the fact that they had to serve under white men in a black man's regiment, feeling they would still be treated like second-class citizens. But trusted abolitionists like Wendell Phillips urged them to prove themselves, for soon their day would come.
If you cannot have a whole loaf, will you not take a slice? For if you are not willing to fight your way up to office, you are not worthy of it. Put yourselves under the stars and stripes and fight yourselves to the marquee of a general, and you shall come out with a sword. Wendell Phillips, 1863.
The officers for Andrew's experiment were carefully hand-picked. They must have proven themselves in battle and come from powerful and respected families with anti-slavery convictions. Robert Gould Shaw fit all those requirements to the button. He was a Boston blue blood who had been wounded in war and came from a wealthy family of conscience. Governor John Andrew wanted him as his colonel.
The Shaw family was one of the first families in Massachusetts. Shaw's parents had been prominent in the anti-slavery crusade, and the governor assumed that Rob, as his family called the young colonel, shared the same values.
But he didn't. As a child of privilege in one of the nation's wealthiest families, he spent much of life away from home in Europe in the best schools. And though his mother, Sarah, was a deeply devoted abolitionist, Shaw didn't believe everything she taught.
There was a certain aimlessness to Shaw before the war. He was a pampered, wealthy young man who had not done well in school, had very little interest in academic pursuits, wasn't quite sure what to do with his life. He was very much, I think, a mama's boy. His mother was a very strong-willed person who enforced her particular philosophy on the entire family, and particularly on her son.
Shaw turned down his first offer to command the 54th. He had not joined the Army 2 years before to free the slaves, and he certainly had no commitment to racial equality. To Shaw, this was an offer full of risks.
We have to remember that he was being asked to do something unprecedented. He would be taking an enormous risk. Until he accepted that mission, he really didn't know any blacks, at least not his people. Also, Shaw, to a certain extent, was a man of his times. His letters are littered with such words as nigger and darky, although as he got to know black men, he did come to respect them as human beings. That kind of childish language fades away before he dies.
Probably because of guilt over his mother, Robert finally accepted and became Colonel Shaw of the 54th Regiment and training quickly began.
Company B, fall in.
As the nation watched, recruits arrived by the hundreds at Camp Meigs, Reedville, Massachusetts. The stakes were high, and the work would be hell.
There were a complex set of commands just for marching, the drill that had to be learned, how to march obliquely one direction, turn around while marching and go the opposite direction. According to some drill manuals, there were 9 separate commands just for loading and firing a weapon, which is why for black soldiers in the 54th, as for white soldiers and all other new regiments, the order of the day was breakfast, drill, some more drill, a break, lunch, and drill, drill, drill until dinner, followed by drill.
The men of the 54th were consumed with a desire to succeed. They were driven. The weight of their race was heavy upon their shoulders. They would even study on their own to succeed in this school of soldiers.
One of Shaw's captains, Cabot Russell, used to talk about how his men would go out and watch white troops do guard mounts and pick up the manual on their own outside of the regular drill sessions, just so they could have a little bit more polish, a little more snap, be a little further ahead in their lessons.
I think that all eyes of the nation were on the 54th. I mean, this was the great laboratory. This was the great experiment. And they were watching to see any hint of unwillingness, inability, inferiority on the part of black troops. On the other side of the coin, blacks recognized the fact that they could show no weakness. They could show no inability to operate. They had to be as perfect as human beings could be.
Every day, and especially on Sundays, crowds gathered at the camp to watch this novel sight of the black men in blue performing. Soon, Meigs became more like a circus ground than a barracks.
Part of it was curiosity. Part of it undoubtedly was still a sort of a condescending kind of smirk behind the handkerchief grin at the sight of blacks trying to be soldiers.
But Shaw was impressed, and he was proud. His men were proving themselves. The men of the 54th were quickly becoming a model for every black soldier that would follow.
The intelligence of the men is a great surprise to me. They learn all the details of guard duty and camp service infinitely more readily than the Irish I have had under my command. There is not the least doubt that we shall leave the state with as good a regiment as any that has marched. Robert Gould Shaw, March 25th, 1863.
In less than 100 days after first learning their drills, the 54th got its orders. They were to leave the barracks of Massachusetts for the tents of South Carolina. They were finally off to war. But not before a farewell parade in Boston. On May 28th, under a cloudless sky, the 54th marched before a crowd of thousands. It was an electric moment.
They were belting out John Brown's Body, which was the anthem of the anti-slavery movement, and the Friends of Anti-Slavery, and blacks were delighted to see the men dressed in the regulation dress U.S. Army uniform, carrying state-of-the-art modern rifle muskets. They were marching with great snap. They were showing that they had learned the lessons of the drill field. They made a tremendous impression.
And they were to march on to glory and prove themselves heroes, every one.
Here on the History Channel.
We are climbing Jacob's ladder. We are climbing Jacob's ladder.
For 2 tedious and sweltering months, the 54th had suffered hardships, mostly on the coastal islands of South Carolina. It was anything but what the men had expected.
If a person were to ask me what I saw south, I should tell him stinkweed, sand, rattlesnakes, and alligators. To tell the honest truth,
Our boys out on picket look sharper for snakes than they do for rebels. Corporal James Henry Gooding, St. Simon's Island, June 1863.
But the 54th had a higher purpose, and the swamps, snakes, and suffocating heat and humidity didn't stop them. They were finally in the South and ready to strike a blow. Their first taste of battle was to be on James Island, one of the small but strategic isles off the coast of Charleston.
In 1863, one of the focal points for Union operations was the city of Charleston. It was important tactically. It could be used to drive a wedge into the South. It was an opportunity to strike at railroad lines and river transportation systems, but also was a very important symbolic element of the war. The Civil War started in Charleston Harbor.
On the early morning of July 16th, Shaw's black soldiers heard their first battle cry. 3 companies of the 54th were on picket duty when the Confederate forces screamed the rebel yell and rushed them. The 54th not only stopped the enemy, but they also saved another Union troop, the 10th Connecticut.
They were hit at dawn by a surprise attack by a superior body of Confederate troops. They held their ground long enough to permit the withdrawal of some white pickets to their left who had their backs against a swamp, and to allow the main body of Union troops on James Island to fall into line of battle. And they gave a very good account of themselves.
That day, the 54th proved they could fight, kill, and die like whites. And by all accounts, they fought bravely. The 54th had won their first battle, but they had lost another one back home. When the black recruits were mustered in, they were promised the same pay as white soldiers, $13 a month. But when the regiment reached the South, the War Department declared Negro soldiers would only receive $10, and 3 of that would be deducted for their uniform. The 54th dearly resented it.
That was a real slap in the face. I mean, after all, they were putting their lives on the line, and you can understand how angry they would have been to have your life undervalued in this way, and so officially undervalued by an official federal pay policy.
The 54th refused to accept even $1 and waited 18 long months before the government offered equal pay. But that would prove too late for some of the men. For just hours after the battle on James Island, the regiment was ordered to Fort Wagner by night. They began a long, dark, and perilous journey. 48 hours without food, sleep, or rest.
They had to go over narrow causeways, little footpaths and bridges, and they were on their feet almost constantly. The first night, it rained. Cats and dogs. Visibility was limited. They were dressed in wool uniforms and they got soaked through, which slowed their progress. They were on the move the next night, getting ready to embark upon a steamer. They had a little rowboat that was used to shuttle them out to the ship, and it had a limited capacity, so most of the men had to spend hours standing out on this beach, and again it rained.
And so the men arrived on Morris Island, wet, worn, and bone-weary. It was almost 6 o'clock at night, and since noon, 41 Union guns and mortars and nearly a dozen warships had hurled 9,000 shells into Fort Wagner.
There were 2 Union brigades formed up on the beach as darkness was falling. All day long, the Union Navy, the ironclads, had been bombarding Fort Wagner. The fort was being pulverized, just pounded and pounded and pounded by those big guns.
It was probably the most intensive artillery barrage in the Civil War, but it did little to weaken Wagner. Built of quartz sand and palmetto palms, and with a bomb-proof shelter, the fort was well constructed. The Union thought there were only about 300 rebels left inside. The truth was, there were 1,200.
They were fresh, they were rested, they had not been decimated by the bombing, and when the attack came, these soldiers had the high ground, they had plenty of cannon and ammunition, and the slope of the wall of the fort was such that they could literally light the fuse on cannonballs and roll them down the hill into the massed troops of the 54th.
The challenge of Wagner was fearsome. For a troop to enter, it must first march through a 50-foot wide moat that was filled with 5 feet of water. Then it must scale a 30-foot high wall of sloping sand. It was simply no job for the weary. Yet by all accounts, Shaw's men were willing. General George C. Strong, leader of the brigade, was going to storm the fort. The only question was, could the 54th lead the way?
I'm a Massachusetts man like you. I know you're tired. I know that you're worn out. But is there any man here who thinks himself unable to sleep in that fort tonight? And all 600 of Shaw's troops leapt to their feet and yelled, "No, no!" And then Strong pointed to the color bearer, and he said, "If that brave color bearer goes down, who will pick up the flag?" And the men, again, they raised their hands. They were jumping up and down with excitement, according to one account, yelling, "Yes, yes, I will, I will."
It was now 7:45, with darkness coming on swiftly when the 54th moved. They were to lead the assault. With the Atlantic Ocean on their right and marshes on their left, the beach began to narrow toward the fort until there was only a tiny passage left. It was there that the Confederates opened fire.
A storm of shot and shell ripped into the regiment. These black soldiers, they had never faced such a concentrated fire before. It tore into their ranks. Lewis Douglass saw shells clearing spaces 20 feet wide, just tearing away human beings. Naturally, they faltered. Their ranks began to break. But it was at that moment that Shaw truly proved his heroism.
Shaw brandished his sword and yelled, "Forward, my brave boys," and then began running. The men charged on.
The men cheered, and then they gave a kind of mad animal shout and ran after him. They were bent over double, like they were running into a hailstorm. But this hail was made out of lead and iron, and it knocked men down for every yard that they covered.
Finally, the brave men rushed headlong into the huge ditch-like moat. Shaw was still leading, still running into the jaws of death. With Wagner's wall lit up by cannon flash, Shaw clambered up the 30-foot sandy slopes, yelling, "Rush on, boys!" Behind him lay a tragic scene of death, and in front of him lay his own.
He's the first one to get to the top, and then he stands erect, raises his sword over his head, yells, "Onward, boys!" At that moment, a North Carolina soldier fires a rifle into his heart.
But even as Shaw fell, the stars and stripes kept flying. The regiment's national colors, their flag, their symbol of freedom, was kept safe from the enemy by the valor of another man, Sergeant William Carney, another member of the 54th, and still another hero.
History Channel.
Sergeant William Carney became a symbol of the heroism of the 54th and was the first black soldier to earn the nation's highest award, the Medal of Honor. And it's not hard to understand why. In the grim, desperate battle in the darkness at Fort Wagner, it was Carney who saved the flag. By this time in the assault, Colonel Shaw was already dead, and men were fighting a vicious hand-to-hand combat with their bayonets. It was pitch dark, and in the moat, Carney saw the color bearer go down. He grabbed the flag, held it close, and began to slowly make his way to the parapet.
He's hearing men who are moaning and groaning. My leg, he's not sure whether he's even stepping on people because it's dark and he can't see. he begins to progress forward again. He begins to see other members. He's assuming that they're members of the 54th, but to his surprise, in the light of a cannon, he sees that the rebels.
Carney took 3 hits, one very serious wound in the shoulder, and yet he never dropped the flag. He made it to the parapet, and only then was he forced to retreat.
He had been hit in both legs. He had to retreat on his knees. He was using one hand to staunch the wound in his breast and his shoulder, and the other hand he was holding onto the flagstaff.
If he did nothing else, that flag had to be put at the top of the parapet. It was that important. It would signify that these men that were dying and moaning and groaning was not in vain, and he knew that.
Sergeant William Carney survived. He didn't stop until he got to a Union field hospital, torn and bleeding. His wounds were so severe that he never fully recovered.
And just before he fainted, he said to the amazed comrades, "I but did my duty, boys. The dear old flag never touched the ground."
The few men of the 54th who had safely scaled the fort's walls and battled on the parapets of Fort Wagner were now forced to retreat and run for their lives. The tide had come in, making the moat waist deep and drowning many of the wounded. But the Union wouldn't give up. Next, the white soldiers of the 6th Connecticut were ordered into the eye of the storm, regiment after regiment, and then another brigade. But their fate was the same as the 54th, and the attack was a terrible and costly failure. And the carnage it left was horrifying.
There were bodies strewn all over the crest of the parapet. They were piled up in the bastion. They lay sprawled down the slope and tangled in the moat where many men had drowned when the tide came in. Just a scene of terrible carnage and slaughter.
The next morning, it was time for the rebels to bury the dead, and they singled out the 54th and their white officers for special dishonor. They were not buried as men, and they got no markers. Their bodies were just thrown in a ditch like logs and covered. And Colonel Shaw, who was hated the most, was also treated the worst.
He was stripped down to his underwear, put on display inside the fort, and then he was dragged outside, a pit was dug, he was thrown at the bottom, and the bodies of 25 of his soldiers were thrown on top. When some Union officers did ask about the whereabouts of Shaw's body, the Confederate troops to whom they were talking replied, "We buried him with his niggers."
The 54th paid a high price to put its stamp on the course of American history. Of the 21 officers and 600 enlisted men Shaw led against Fort Wagner, 272 were killed, captured, or wounded. But in that one gallant rush, the 54th transcended the word hero, for they had risked their own lives for a better life for others.
That sacrifice, that knowing, willing sacrifice for the betterment of an enslaved and despised race, is in the truest sense a martyrdom. And I think it's one of the most noble, self-effacing acts of bravery that ever transpired on a battlefield of a civil war.
Because of the 54th, other black men were allowed to fight. They opened the floodgates for thousands of others to serve. Near the end of the war, there were more black soldiers in the field than the Confederacy had in its entire army.
Abraham Lincoln argued that the contribution of black soldiers in the Civil War was crucial to the winning of that war. I mean, he made no bones about the fact that he thought that it was very doubtful whether the war could have been won without the involvement and the sacrifice of black troops.
There were some black troops before the 54th, and certainly there were many after. But it is this regiment that will always be remembered. These were the men whose flags of freedom were always flying high. And these were the men whose dreams of hope and glory will never, never die.
Here comes our flag, all free without a strain. We'll fight to defend it as our fathers did so brave. From gallant company, we'll make the rebels dance. We'll stand by the Union if we only have a chance.
Now, an exclusive offer from the History Channel.
Coming up next, feel free to howl at the moon as In Search of History explores the myths about werewolves. Then Robert Rogers helps develop the concept of commando warfare as he leads his American Revolutionary Rangers against the British on History Alive's presentation of Frontier, Legends of the Old Northwest.
For additional information, read The Negro Civil War, How American Blacks Felt and Acted During the War for the Union by James M. McPherson, and Free at Last, a documentary history of slavery, freedom, and the Civil War.